Here we go. All right.
Awesome. So can you see my screen with the pictures and the map?
Yes. Yep.
Perfect. All right. So thank you all for having me. And thank you, Jennifer, for coordinating this with me and communicating with me. My first OOPS meeting, but I feel like it might not be my last. I live in Columbia County. I live kind of in the area between Scappoose and St. Helens in Warren. So anyone familiar with the Scappoose Bay Next Adventure Paddling Center? I'm right up the hill from there. You can see Warren on the map here. And I'm going to talk tonight just about kayaking on the Columbia River inside Columbia County and some of the birds that I like to see there and some of the islands that I like to visit. So sounds like this will probably be kind of things folks in this group would already know, but obviously the Columbia River's tidal pretty far up, sometimes all the way up to Bonneville Dam. And so, you know, in the area where I usually paddle around Rainier and St. Helens, the river can actually flow backwards twice a day, and there can be lots of things that influence the tidal shift. So a couple apps that I like to use on my phone, I have the logos to the right of the screen there. I just use the Tides app, and the thing I like about that specific app is that it pings the closest tide reader, not like the one that you set as your home one. So if I'm driving long distances around the county, it always gives me an accurate reading for the closest spot. And I also like to use that marine traffic app partially to see what's out there and to learn a little bit about the ships that are moving around on the river. And then in terms of birding, I use eBird. For those of you that are not familiar, eBird is a free app and website where birders can keep track of all the bird species they see at a specific time in a specific place. It's run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology out of New York. But birders use it to keep track of their own sightings. And then you can also see all the other birders' sightings. Everything's public. So I can keep track of all the birds I see in my yard. You can keep track of all the birds you see while you're out paddling. And you could also look up on eBird, you know, where the closest screech owl is in your neighborhood. And you can see when and where someone saw it. And sometimes people add pictures and audio clips. And it's basically a giant community science website with bird sightings globally. So I post all my paddles and bird watching endeavors on eBird, and some of the maps I have on my slideshow tonight are just straight from my eBird account. And then another app you might think about getting, especially if you're interested in starting to bird while you're paddling, is Merlin, which is also run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. It's also free. And the great thing about Merlin is you can put in your location and the date, and it can organize the birds by family or by likelihood of spotting it out in the wild. So if you organize the birds by likelihood, the birds at the top of the list are the things you're going to see most likely on the river, which can be a really nice way to eliminate rare and unusual birds that you probably aren't seeing and learn which ones are most common in your area. And then the last one I use is Onyx Hunt, which you do have to pay for, but Columbia County has enough private property and logging company owned land, and it's just a nice way to out in the field figure out if you're on land that you're allowed to be on, and if not, who owns it. And it's updated regularly, and there's a lot of information in there. A lot of stuff on Onyx Hunt that I haven't been able to find online, especially in terms of some of the river islands and some of the entry points I've found for putting in and out the boat. Some of the other safety things I put here, just things I think about in terms of like knowing where the main channel is, so you can either avoid it or cross it in an intentional way. Just because of the huge commercial shipping traffic on the Columbia River. It sounds like a lot of you paddle on the river, so I'm sure you're well aware. I often try and stay on the shoulders or in the side sloughs, but also remember to stay visible, especially in the wintertime, because lots of folks are out there fishing or hunting from boats. Again, I'm sure a lot of paddlers here know, but when I tell like my Portland friends who aren't out on the Columbia River paddling that there are people shooting ducks from boats in the early morning on the river, they're kind of shocked to learn that that's not only allowed, but pretty common in certain areas. So yeah, some other obstacles. I mean, again, I think a lot of people in this group probably know, but just out on the river, there's logs floating around, sometimes whole trees. There's huge ships you have to watch out for. That picture in the top right is a blind boat, which when that boat covered in bird blind material is parked on the bank and you paddle by, it can be pretty well hidden, which is understandably sort of terrifying. And when you suddenly hear a gunshot so close to your boat. And then I'm sure folks here are familiar with the pile dikes or the wing dams, especially when you're paddling near the islands. They're often sticking out from the side, or they're like in front, I guess, downriver of the island. I think it's partially to mark the channel. And I think on some of the dredged islands, it helps with erosion. But when the river's high, sometimes that whole pile dike is underwater or almost underwater, and that can be kind of a danger. But they're marked often by these vertical danger dike signs. So at least there's something to look out for on most of them. Before I get into the birds and the actual places I like to go, this is just the gear I use. I have a super old, like 20-year-old Dagger crossover boat. It's sort of a weird crossover boat. So it's sort of short, but it's not quite a whitewater boat. It's not as long as like an ocean kayak. It's sort of this weird in between. It just has one compartment in the back, and I use it mostly for day trips. And that's the boat I've always had. And I keep thinking it's time for me to get a better one, but I haven't made that happen yet. I'm an elementary school teacher, so I work during the school year, and then on the weekends I do a lot of paddling, and in the summer I do a lot of paddling, and it's just the boat I have and the boat I love. I've got a big birding camera. It's like a Nikon D7200 for any camera nerds here. And while I'm paddling, I usually keep it in my dry bag when I'm really crossing the river or going on a long paddle. And then once I'm close to an island or in a slough or in a place where I'm going to try and take photographs of birds, I'll lay it kind of on my lap on a towel. I always wear a spray skirt because I almost always have an expensive camera on my lap, and I just don't want any drip or water getting in on it. But it can be challenging to photograph birds from the kayak. So maybe when I get into some of the photos later, I can give some tips for anyone interested. But all the photos of birds and animals in the slideshow are mine. And it's part of the reason why I like being out on the river looking for birds, is to get nice photographs of them in action. And then I always have my vortex binoculars just around my neck while I'm on the water. So when thinking about the most common river birds that I feel like I first learned to identify, especially in the winter, which is when I do a lot of the paddling on the river, the scaups, which are on the left here, show up in huge numbers, like giant rafts of scaup. And there's two kinds here, lesser scaup and greater scaup. And a lot of times when you look up bird species online or use bird apps, they say lesser scaup is really common and greater scaup is much less common. But I actually see about 50-50. So I think it might be more that people misidentify them because they're so similar. They really look almost identical. The lesser scaup has a pointier head. You can see it's kind of almost has like a little corner on the back. That's kind of like what I look for to recognize the lesser scaup. And then the greater scaup has a super rounded head. It's one of those identifications that when you first see the scaup alone, it can be tough. But then when you see two side by side, one of each species, you really can tell that difference, and you can get a little bit better at recognizing them. Greater scaup not only have way rounder heads, but they have way shinier heads too. You can even see in this picture, there's sort of like some green, almost like mallard hues to it. And they tend to be kind of like shinier and cleaner looking. Sorry?
I think maybe we just had someone who didn't know they were unmuted. So I'm gonna.
That's okay. Another really common bird that you see, not as in large numbers, not in huge rafts, but buffleheads are really common on the Columbia River, especially in winter. And the males have this really distinct, huge white patch on the whole back kind of third of their head. The females look a lot different. They're almost all black with a white cheek patch. But most of these water birds, especially the ducks, a lot of times the females look so similar to one another, it can be hard to identify them. So you might identify a group of ducks by the males that you see in it and kind of make some guesses about the others there. Buffleheads are pretty common, and then golden eyes are really common on the river in the winter too. And they're going to be even smaller groups, like maybe pairs, groups of 4, groups of 6. And one really good distinguishing field mark is the white patch right on their lower, right on their kind of at the end of their face before their bill. There's a less common goldeneye that you'll run into more as you go towards Astoria and towards the ocean, but don't come upriver as much, called a Barrow's goldeneye. It looks almost exactly the same, but instead of the white patch being circular, it's crescent shaped. And instead of a kind of green hue, it has more of a blue hue. So it's kind of another fun two species that are closely related, but fun to tell the difference between. Spotted sandpipers are here year round, and they're all over the Columbia River. They're on Oregon and Washington shores and on all the islands. It's a super common bird. I feel like I see all the birds on this slide basically every time I paddle on the river. And spotted sandpipers are another one that kind of go unchecked or don't get documented as much as you'd think, because they're tiny, they're kind of always moving, but they're always along the beaches on the river islands, and they love running on those pile dikes and on kind of like boom logs, and they hang out around near marinas. They're kind of everywhere. Once you learn how to spot them, I feel like they're a great example of a bird that you identify more for size, shape, and the way they move, less about the field marks, because they look like a lot of other sandpipers. But they fly with really stiff wing beats. They move really quick and low over the water, and then they kind of are running along the water's edge pretty constantly.
So I've got to ask
Oh,
a
yeah.
quick question.
Go ahead.
The greater and lesser scaup, are these considered ducks in the buffalo
Yeah.
head?
Yeah, they're
What are the
diving
ducks?
The scops, the bufflehead, and the goldeneye are all considered ducks. Some people might consider these mergansers ducks, but mergansers sort of fall into a different category. But all of these ducks are diving ducks. So like the ducks you see in your pond or park are called dabbling ducks. So if you think of like a mallard, like just floating in a little pond, when it feeds, it just tips over basically and sticks its butt up in the air and roots around for food. All these ducks that are on the river are diving ducks. So you'll see them in groups in rafts, and then, they'll go under, and some of these species stay under for a long time as they're finding crustaceans and fish and shrimp and things. And they'll spend a long time underwater swimming around. Yeah, I think these would all be considered ducks. Probably technically the goldeneye and maybe the scaup would be like sea ducks, because they're found in the ocean as well. But the Columbia River, they come pretty far up. So yeah, these last group is the common mergansers, and great example of sexual dimorphism in birds where the male and female look like totally different species. The male has like a bright green head, female has a really shaggy brown crest. Fun species to learn to identify, and they're pretty common on the river as well. Speaking of ducks, lots of ducks on the river, and ducks can be really fun to learn. Like I said, early on in birding careers, the females can be pretty tough because a lot of them are similar. But since ducks tend to stay with similar species or sometimes are paired off, a lot of times there's enough males in the group that you can kind of guess which ones the females are based on who they're with. Of course, the well-known mallard with the green head, white necklace, brown chest and gray flanks, bright orange bill. The female's kind of all brown, and the female mallard is the duck that makes the actual duck quack. So if you're ever out on the water and you hear a duck quack, like in a cartoonish kind of quack, quack, quack way, that's just the female mallard. All these other ducks make totally different sounds, like raspy sounds or whistle sounds, or a huge variety. Gadwalls are pretty common on the river. They're a really beautiful duck up close. From far away, they're a really boring duck, but they're like a beautiful brown, tons of different hues. One really good distinguishing field mark for gadwalls is the dark bill and the dark feathers towards the rear. The dark rump really stands out. Green-winged teals are another great bird to see on the river. A really small duck that maybe if you just saw on a pond or paddled by, you wouldn't really realize how small it is until it's next to a gadwall or a mallard. It's like half the size of a mallard, really tiny little toy duck with a beautiful green stripe that runs around its eye to the back. Surf scoters, I don't see a ton of on the river near me, but I'm pretty close to the Portland side of things. When I go out like Kathlamet Island area that folks were talking about earlier, when I go off Jones Beach and off Klatskanai, I do see some surf scoters sometimes. Those are real ocean ducks that you'll see at the beach all the time. But it's fun when they do come upriver, and it's really fun to see them up close because they're super clownish looking. They have that bright white beady eye and then the white patches on the beak and on the head. And they just are really, really cool to see up close. With all these birds and with some of the island trips I'll talk about in a few minutes, it's if you're not moving your arms or paddle around, I'm sure a lot of you have had this experience and you just are kind of keeping your body still and you're just floating along once you get close to birds. I really think they don't perceive people the way they would if you were ever on foot or on bike or, moving in any other way. I think they kind of register you as like a floating log. So a lot of times I'll kind of position myself upriver or up current from a big raft of birds, and I'll just kind of get my camera out and kind of stop moving and just float towards them. And one great thing I think about paddling and birding at the same time is if you're still and bobbing along, you can get super close to some of these birds that would normally be really difficult to get close to, even if they were swimming near shore, because as soon as you walk down the beach, they would fly away. Ringneck ducks are very common, and they're often mixed in with scaup. So they can be kind of a tough ID because they're pretty similar to scaup color-wise, but They're a great example of a bird that's was named by early ornithologists who had the bird dead in their hands when they were deciding what to call it. And it does have a ring around its neck, but you almost never see it. So it's called the ringneck duck, but it's probably better to think of it as the ring-billed duck because it has this white ring around the edge of its bill where it meets its head. And that really stands out when it's mixed in with the scaup, who both totally lack the white there. The dark feathers go right up to the bill. American widgeons are great. Once you learn the sound they make, a sort of snorty, whistly sound, you'll hear them all the time on the river. They can also be in pretty big groups, and they sort of have the green-winged teal, green, I don't know what you call that streak that goes from the eye to the back of the head, but they're a lot larger, and they have this really kind of bright white forehead. So they that white forehead really stands out. American coots are on the river as well, kind of all black duck with a white beak, and on the water, they really look like a duck, but on land, they really look like a chicken. They have really long toes, really big feet. They can like walk on water vegetation without sinking because just huge surface area on the feet. Coots are really goofy and they kind of run on the water in a funny way. And I think like the crazy like a coot idiom just comes from them. They're always kind of like running around, squawking, squabbling. Really fun bird. Another great bird to see up close because from far away, it's like a weird black duck chicken hybrid, but close up they have a beautiful red eye. The beak, the shield of the beak comes up really high on their forehead, so instead of like a duck bill that kind of sits down low on the face, the beak kind of comes up the forehead in a really cool way. And then swans, we have tundra and trumpeter swans. I'm not sure why I only put tundra up here, but swans are on the river all the time. I feel like they're often flying over the river and then finding calmer waters on either shore, but I see them all the time when I'm paddling on the Columbia. And from far away, a tundra swan and a trumpeter swan will look pretty similar. The trumpeter has more yellow lore up near its eye, and the black of the beak kind of wraps around the eye more, but it's a great example of a bird that you like, once you learn the call, then you don't really need to look at all those details. A trumpeter swan sounds like a trumpet. It's like a horn. It's very, it's a very distinguishing sound. And then the tundra swan makes sort of typical swan honky noises that aren't quite as brass instrument-like. And then finally, loons and grebes. And these birds on this slide are all in their winter plumage because that's when they're on the river in greater numbers. If you look up any of these birds in a field guide, they look a lot more exciting and interesting because their breeding plumage is different. So most birds molt multiple times a year between like a breeding plumage and a non-breeding plumage. Red-throated loon's a great example of a loon that I love seeing and photographing on the river. And every time I post a photo somewhere, someone says, red-throated loon, like not a great name for that bird. Its throat is white, but in the summer when it's breeding further north than us, it has a bright red throat, which is really amazing looking, but we never get to see it because we live too far south. So the three loons can be really tough to identify. So I feel like just first looking for loons and finding loons, they're almost always alone, sometimes in a pair. They dive and stay under for a really long time, and they will pop up very far away from where you saw them go under. The common loon has the chunkiest bill, the thickest kind of dagger-like bill, and they have a really steep forehead. You see in this profile, there's really kind of like a knob above its head. The red-throated loon almost always holds its bill up at kind of a 45-degree angle, which from a distance can be a really easy way to distinguish it from the other loons. It has a much thinner bill, much pointier. And then the Pacific loon, I kind of think of it as like the in-between loon. The beak's not tiny. It doesn't really get held up at the same angle as the red-throated, but it has a much rounder head than the common loon. It doesn't have that knob on the forehead. And then if you're close enough to tell, Pacific loons have a little necklace, which you can just barely see in this photo, but they always have like a black thin line that runs underneath their chin. Grebes, which are closely related to loons, the three we see the most common on the river are horned grebes, western grebes, and pied-billed grebes. Pied-bills are all over, and you'll see them in streams and ponds and parks, but they're also on the river. They're really tiny. Unlike the diving ducks and the loons that will go from a floating position and then dive kind of head first down, pied-billed loons just sink. So they don't like tip, they don't go head first. They just like lower themselves like a submarine, just like going straight down, which is really fun to see up close. Horned grebes and western grebes can be kind of similar from a distance, but the westerns are way larger and they have a really big, pretty bright yellow bill. Both those grebes have red eyes. And I feel like Western grebes on the Columbia, I'll see 1 or 2 at a time on a paddle, and then horned grebes, sometimes there'll be a dozen altogether. But looking for that kind of black and white pattern where the black runs through the eye and then there's like a white cheek and white throat is a pretty good way to distinguish the grebes from something like a loon.
I have a question about the grebes.
Yeah.
Physically, how do they lower themselves down? They can't be letting out air because they need that air, but how do they do that?
That's a really good question. I will have to look that up. I don't know. I feel like pied-bill grebes, yeah, I don't know. They're like buoyant wizards. They do like really crazy things, and I'm realizing I don't know how they just kind of sink. I will look that up. I'll email Jennifer. She can tell you all at the next meeting. There are tons of gulls to see on the Columbia River, especially in the winter, especially in February when there's like spawning happening and there's a ton of food resources on the river. Gulls are, even among birders, sort of a sore spot because identification can be really hard. These are 6 kind of common gulls that I see on the Columbia, and this is just like adult plumage. Gulls go through tons of different plumage stages. They'll have a different plumage their first year of life, their second, their third, sometimes their fourth. So there's different cycles of plumage before they're adults. They'll have like a breeding plumage and a non-breeding plumage. They can look tons of different ways, and they can all hybridize. So you can see a gull and think, oh, you know, that's a glaucous winged, but it's like mixed with a Western. It has kind of features of both. And I don't think I'm going to bore you all with all the intricacies of gull ID. I'm also not a gull expert, and there are gull experts out there. But the most common here are glaucous winged. I mean, it means gray winged. So if you see a bird that just has totally gray wings, no black wing tips, nothing unusual, gray, I should point out, these are the wing tips. The tail is down here, and the thing that sticks out above is the tip of the wing folded back. So on the glaucous winged, you can see it's all gray. It's all gray winged. Ring-billed gulls have black wingtips that stick out the back, as do California, short-billed, and Westerns. So and Bonapartes too. So that black in the back, if you don't see that, it's a glaucous winged gull. Ring-billed, the really distinguished feature is the ring on the bill, and it's not always there, but once you get good at identifying ring-bills, even if the black ring's not there, you'll start recognizing them by the shape of their head, the shape of their bill, that sort of thing. California gulls, I feel like, are kind of, in my mind, like the leftover gull. If it's not a ring billed and it's not a short billed and it's gray with black wingtips and it's got yellow feet, it's a California. I should point out that glaucous winged have pink feet. So with gulls, there's so many things to remember. I feel like this is really kind of insane combination of head shape, bill size, the kind of relative size difference between head and bill. Then there's the mantle color, which is this like kind of back part, the wingtip color, and if there's any features like white dots or stripes, and then the leg color. And so different combinations of all those things can lead you to a specific species. And a lot of times, even on my eBird checklist, I just put gull because it was some kind of gull, and I don't know which one it was. Westerns are pink-footed, and they're huge, and their mantle's a lot darker, and they're a lot less common in the river. They're more common on the coast. Short-billed used to be called mew gulls. They changed the name last year. And this picture doesn't show it great, but they have a much smaller bill. It's really petite, especially when you see it compared to any of the gulls in the top row. They really have kind of a smaller, cuter face. Their eye is like bigger on their head. So they have sort of a kind of cartoonish, kid-like quality to them. And then Bonapartes really stand out. And once you see one, you'll, I don't know, I get really excited when I see Bonapartes. They're fun, they're playful. Another kind of coast bird that comes inland sometimes, really thin black bill and a really cool black cheek patch. And usually they're in a little group, so you'll kind of see them all together.
I did a quick Google and I learned about the grebe and how they can just sink down.
Oh, please tell us.
Says that they have an ability to adjust their buoyancy by compressing the plumage and forcing air out of their feathers. And so then they just sink down because they push the air out of their feathers. So not their lungs, like Carol was maybe thinking, but yeah.
Incredible. Yeah, grebes do some wild things. Grebes also, they eat a lot of really bony fish and things whole. But unlike a falcon or an owl that will like cough up a pellet with all the fur and bones of the things they eat, they actually eat their own feathers, and the feathers like create like a sieve, like a filtering system, so that the food particles can get through, but the bony stuff gets stuck, and then they cough that up in this. It's called a pellet, but it's really more like just a tangled mess of like feathers and bones and stuff. Really kind of gnarly. That's kind of the bird focused stuff. And then the rest of my slideshow, I fear I'm going to need to go a little bit faster, but I just, in 2019, that winter, 2019, 2020, I decided to paddle around the 12 river islands in Columbia County that are on the Oregon side of the state line. So there's 62 miles of Columbia River in Columbia County, and there's 12 sandy islands on the Oregon side. And I kind of did like a big kayak year where I tried to visit each island, paddle around it, look for birds on it, document what birds I found on them. And I've been back to a bunch of the islands since then, and I have some favorites that I go to a lot. I've still only done day trips, so it's cool to hear some of you talking about camping, because I've wanted to camp on a lot of these islands, and I have some maps I'll show you in a minute of where you are supposed to camp on these islands. But I moved to Columbia County in 2018, and I did a big year the very next year, 2019. For those of you that don't know, a big year is when a birder tries to see as many different bird species as they can in a calendar year. And I got really into it, and the river island paddling was a big part of it, because I found a lot of birds on the river and on the islands that are not found anywhere else in the county, or that had never been seen in the county. So it turned out to be a really great place to find birds in general, but also rare and unusual birds. So this map kind of shows all my paddle routes around the islands, and I'm just going to start at the bottom and go north and then west. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Lower Columbia River Water Trail. When you go to their website, Lower Columbia Estuary Partnerships website, it has this interactive map with tons of information about places to launch boats, places to camp, places to stop. And there's tons of trip recommendations on there too. I used this map a lot when I first got started, just trying to figure out kind of where to go and how to get there. So starting down by Portland, Sauvie Island, the south half of Sauvie Island is in Multnomah County, but the north half is in Columbia County. The main places I use to get into the water are the Sauvie Island boat ramp, which is in Multnomah County, just north of the bridge. The Gilbert River boat ramp, which is on the Columbia County side, that you have to drive up the east side of the river to get to, but you end up launching onto the west side of the island, onto Multnomah Channel. The Sturgeon Lake boat ramp can be hit or miss depending on water levels, because sturgeon is tidal and seasonal. Sometimes it's just mud. And then there's not an official boat ramp, but the Warrior Point area near the Warrior Point trailhead and even the beaches, the Sauvie Island beaches, sometimes I'll just go in right there if I'm going to be paddling north. So the best place I think to paddle on Sauvie Island is Sturgeon Lake, and the best time to do it is April to October, which is technically the only time you can do it. From October to April, it's closed for hunting, and there's a big sign as you come down the Gilbert River saying that you should not go past it for those months. But I put in at the Gilbert River boat ramp, and I paddled down the Gilbert River. It's about 5 miles to an area that birders call the Wash. Birders like to walk out to the Wash and look out this way over Sturgeon Lake, especially as the tide's going out and shorebirds are congregating on the mudflats. And then you can see from this kayak, this is a map from eBird. So I paddled down the Gilbert River to the Wash, and then I kind of went out and around to see what birds are out there. I like to kind of beach on a mudflat and then just not move for a while. And eventually birds kind of forget that you're a person in a bright orange kayak, and they start approaching you, and sandpipers will come feed right next to you. Sandhill cranes will walk right over to you. American white pelicans will walk right over to you. Sometimes I just sit out there for a really long time. And then you can continue down the Gilbert River all the way down to the county line with Multnomah County. If the water's high, you can loop around and go over here into, I think what's called Wagon Wheel Bay. Sometimes you can even connect over to Mud Lake and Steelman Lake. Like sometimes all these waterways are connected some years in the spring, especially when the water's still high. And then kind of late summer, fall, things start feeling like separate waterways. It's kind of harder to navigate. But on Sauvie Island, I see tons of awesome stuff in the fall, especially. There's these huge mixed flocks of shorebirds that are migrating through. So this photo shows western sandpipers, probably least sandpipers, sanderlings, which are these ones that kind of stand out as being a little bit bigger and bright white, and black-bellied plovers, which are much bigger and have kind of a golden wash to their face. I've run into a bunch of really rare plovers on Sturgeon Lake, which is really exciting. This is an American golden plover, which is a really tough bird to find kind of anywhere, but they usually show up on the Oregon coast, not so much this far inland, but I found a couple on Sauvie. And then Sauvie's sort of famous for the sandhill cranes, and for good reason. They're huge and they're really charismatic, and they fight and dance and they throw sticks up in the air and they do all these bizarre things to impress each other. And it's really fun to watch them. Some other pictures from Sauvie, just with some birds that are exciting to see out there. American white pelicans. Once you learn to recognize them in flight, like a big white bird with black wingtips, you'll see flocks flying even over downtown Portland. There's quite a lot of American white pelicans in the region, but if you don't get good at spotting them flying over, you might not know that. But then you go to a place like Sauvie Island and there's like hundreds, sometimes thousands just hanging out in the middle of Sturgeon Lake. A really just beautiful bird, and really different behavior from the brown pelicans that you'd see if you went to the Oregon coast in the summer. Brown pelicans are like flying around, they're soaring, they dive in the water to catch fish. American white pelicans don't dive. They're like floating around. They're kind of like bobbing and dipping their bill in the water, and they collectively feed. So they'll kind of move all together to push some fish up against a bank or a mud flat, and then they'll all kind of feed together, which is going to be really fun to watch. Parasitic jaeger is another bird that's seen on the coast sometimes. Usually you'd have to go out in a boat, but it's fun to see inland. They look like a gull, but they act like a falcon or a hawk. They hunt, they basically harass other birds for food. They don't do any of their own hunting. So they see a gull catch something and they go after that gull and attack it and steal the food from it. So it's called being kleptoparasitic, and it's a really cool way to be if you're a bird, and you will have people watching you through binoculars because it's like really dramatic. There's lots of chase scenes and fights, and it's a really cool bird to run into, especially when you're sitting in a kayak and it's flying right by you, chasing gulls and attacking. And then there's tons of different sandpipers, but one that I love seeing out there is the pectoral sandpiper, which is pretty big. It stands kind of tall, has this sort of slightly curved beak. And then one good distinguishing mark for pectorals is the speckling stops really abruptly. There's like this clean line where it turns to a white belly. A lot of other sandpipers that are similar looking don't have that feature. So it's a kind of a good one to know if you're deciding if you're looking at a pectoral or some other similar sandpiper, is this clean line on the breast. Another quick paddle from the same starting spot is J.J. Collins Memorial Park, which is a tiny island on Multnomah Channel. So it's from the same starting point, the Gilbert Boat Ramp, but instead of going down the Gilbert River, you stay on Multnomah Channel, and you're basically paddling along the dike next to Scappoose. So Scappoose Bottoms, Honeyman Road is on this side, and you're heading down towards Multnomah County. And J.J. Collins is a small island. It's like 23 acres, but it's got a little nature trail. It's got campsites, picnic tables, and it's a really quick paddle. It's like 2 miles from the ramp down there. I've seen a lot of people camp there, usually folks on sailboats and motorboats, but I think it'd be a really fun, really easy kind of after work kayak camp spot. And then I think a lot of you are probably familiar with Scappoose Bay because the Next Adventure Paddling Center's there. Like I said, I live right up the hill from there. So I paddle out of Scappoose Bay a lot. It can be really calm and quiet. There's lots of little backwaters to explore, lots of great like amphibians and birds to see in those little back waterways. You can see on the map here, there's tons of little areas to explore just south of the marina, but you can also go north from there. And sometimes I'll paddle from there north to St. Helens or to the tip of Sauvie Island and come around that side of Warrior Point. You know, they have a great setup here for getting in and out quickly. Some things I've seen in Scappoose Bay that I feel like I see a lot there that can be fun to see from a boat. Green herons. A lot of you are probably familiar with great blue herons because they're kind of everywhere. Green herons is its much smaller, more secretive cousin that there are tons of in Scappoose Bay. A really fun heron to watch. They've got a really long neck that's all folded and scrunched up. So in this picture, it doesn't really have a neck, but then when it's like hunting or going for something, it stretches it way out. It can be pretty entertaining to watch. Tons of river otters in Scappoose Bay. I see them in those little back channels all the time. In the summer, purple martins nest there, which if you're familiar with purple martins, you know, they're really gregarious and they make a lot of really fun chattery noises. And they people hang purple martin nests. You might have seen those like white gourd shaped nests that people hang on little posts. In Scappoose Bay, they actually mostly nest in old pylons. So there's a lot of old just wood structures on the river, and they have little cavities that they nest in there. Another one that you see a lot in Scappoose Bay, because there's some pretty significant mud flats when the river's low, are greater yellowlegs, which basically look like giant sandpipers on kind of stilt-like legs and with a much longer pointy bill. Those are very common around Scappoose Bay, and they're kind of always walking around the water's edge, feeding like a sandpiper. So going north from there, the next few slides are just basically the islands and kind of where I leave from when I visit, how long it takes, and what some of the birds are that I see on each one. So Sand Island is right off of St. Helens. It's 32 acres. It's literally right across from downtown. There's a ferry service now that goes between downtown and the island. There's a private campground there that you can book online ahead of time, and they have horseshoes and games and things, and, you know, pretty nice bathrooms. And in the summer, it can be a pretty crowded and busy place. But it's just a quick loop from Gray Cliffs, which is a free parking public park right across the way. This is kind of what the kayak ramp looks like there. It's pretty simple, just a gravel path to the water. But if you start at Gray Cliffs, it's just like 2 miles to go around Sand Island, which is kind of a nice paddle. A lot of times, like you can see on this map, I actually come from the south because I just make it longer by leaving from Scappoose Bay. And Sand Island always has tons of nesting ospreys in the summer. There's like a nesting pair on almost every dolphin or piling on the water. So tons of ospreys to watch hunt, which can be really fun. Sand Island and a lot of the other ones I'm about to list have horned larks on them. This is a subspecies of horned lark called the streaked horned lark. It's very yellow, and it's, I'm not going to get this right. It's federally threatened, and I think the state has it as endangered. They have different understandings if you know what that means, but there aren't a lot of streaked horned larks left because there's not a lot of streaked horned lark habitat left. But one kind of habitat they like is these sand dredged islands. They're like not a lot of vegetation, they're pretty open, and that's where they like to nest. They nest right on the ground. They don't build any kind of nest, they just make a little depression and they lay eggs right there, and the eggs look like little rocks. And so these flat, open, sandy, dredge spoil islands are kind of primo horned lark habitat. Just from human development, there's a lot less of that kind of like open, rocky terrain without a lot of plants. So horned larks are on those islands. They're kind of around like airports in the Willamette Valley and not a lot of other places. And then harbor seals, of course, I see a lot around Sand Island. I think it's where the Lewis River meets the Columbia, and there's lots of nutrients there. So there's a lot of mammals, otters, and seals. The next one up will be Goat Island, which is off of Deer Island. So if you're ever driving Highway 30 and you go through Scappoose, through St. Helens, the next kind of community after Columbia City is Deer Island. And off of Deer Island is Goat Island, which is 1.5 miles long. I'm sure a lot of you know this website, the Columbia River, A Photographic Journey, columbiariverimages.com. It's all information about the river, the islands, the history, and there's a lot of Lewis and Clark focus with like entries and what landmarks they're referring to. And I always like just reading on there and seeing if the places I'm paddling are part of any of that history. So Goat Island's one of them. In 1806, they stopped and ate breakfast there. And so there's like a little spot and you can totally tell where they would have stopped, which is kind of cool to think about. Goat Island is awesome because there are tons of little inlets. So you can see on this map, this is me just starting at the southern tip, paddling up the outside. And then I got off my kayak and walked around the inside. But then this whole inside passage here and here is all on the water. So there's lots of little inlets that go pretty deep into the island. So it's like about an 8-mile loop if I leave from the beach just south of here. There's a public park called Pixie Park where you can park basically right at the edge of the river, carry your boat 20 feet and get in. And it's a really nice starting point for exploring Goat Island. Goat Island's a great place to see Bonaparte's gulls. The north side of the island's really shallow, and I think it's like gull depth. So they're often like standing in the water there. Lots of harbor seals, and great place to see river birds like grebes and loons. The next one up is Sandy Island, which is off of Goble. So again, if you're driving Highway 30, the next town is Goble, it's just a tavern and a marina. But Sandy Island is right off of it. So it's a little confusing. There's Sand Island in St. Helens and then Sandy Island in Goble. But if you're familiar with like Kalama and the McMinimans there, it's the island you look across at. And Sandy Island's a great paddle. It's like a 7-mile loop. I start at Goble Marina and I go down and around. This map shows a longer route where I've kind of explored some of the dredge spoils down here as well. But Getting in at Gulbo Marina is really easy. It's a little cement boat ramp, and then you can see Sand Island right here in this picture, or sorry, Sandy Island. Lots of river otters. Another place with streaked horned larks, you can see in the bottom left, really cool bird to see. Sandy Island actually has this whole area at the southern tip that's has signs saying basically keep off because it's horned lark nesting habitat. So I think that's a Port of Portland project, and you're not supposed to go to the southern tip, and then there are some areas just north of there that are designated camp spots, which I think would be a really cool place to camp. Not July 4th weekend. For some reason, there's always tons of people out there, but like any other time of year, it seems like a total dead zone. So there's that sign for the streaked horned lark habitat area. And it's a place I've seen a ton of beavers, and I'm not sure why, because I don't know where they're damming up what water that's coming into the river there, but I always see beavers swimming across the slough between Sandy Island and the Oregon side. So I feel like I see beavers around ponds near my house, but I never see them on the river except in this one spot. So there must be a population right there. Picture of a common loon that I saw at Sandy Island. The next one up is Past Rainier, and there's two islands here. There's Lord Island. Lord Island's up here, I guess, and then Walker Island down here. But a lot of locals call the whole thing Dibblee Island. There's a park right here, a county park called Dibblee Point. And that's a great place to launch from. And then you can explore Dibblee Island or the two, Lord and Walker. This map's maybe a little confusing, but the top route is starting in downtown Rainier. So paddling along Rainier under the Lewis and Clark Bridge that connects to Longview, and then around Lord Island. The bottom map is starting on the other side, closer to Clatskanie, and paddling down to go to Walker Island. But tons of little sloughs and inlets and places to explore in there. There's a lot of hunting in the winter, a lot of people with those boats that are all made to look like brushy plants. So it can be a little scary if it's foggy or early in the morning, but on a bright, sunny winter day, it's like a really great place to paddle. There's just so many little hidden spots kind of inside that island. And there's some camping there too. All these camping pictures are from that Estuary Partnership website, which has really clearly designated maps about where you can camp. And it's always free, and it's always just kind of leave no trace policy. One cool thing is you paddle by an old fish station next to Mager, which is kind of a cool old structure to see. It's where they used to repair fishing nets, and I guess they used to sell salmon out of that location too. And depending on which way you go, you can paddle under the Lewis and Clark Bridge. And then Lord and Walker and the next island just have tons of Columbian white-tailed deer. Some parts of these islands are part of the Julia Hansen Reserve, but some of them aren't. And the Columbia white-tailed deer are just really fun to see on these tiny islands. They look a lot like the deer I see around my neighborhood, except a giant fluffy white tail. It's like really stands out. It's a really cool species to see. And it's also federally recognized as a threatened species. It's a subspecies of white-tailed deer, but I think the subspecies is considered threatened. And then the next one is Crims Island, which I almost always access off Mager Beach. And this is my favorite island to visit out of all the ones in this slideshow. It's huge. The different parts of the island are really different, and there's just a really wide variety of wildlife, especially birds. And I think part of that's just that it's a wide part of the river. So there's a lot of loons and grebes and big rafts of scaup out on the kind of more like oceanic feeling part of the river. But then this whole slough, which is called Bradbury Slough, is full of ducks and, in the spring and summer, tons of songbirds. And it's just a really great mix of things. It's a long paddle to go all the way around, but on a nice day, it's really great. So from Mager Beach, I usually go out on the outside. This whole island is called Crims Island, but this kind of section of it, which isn't actually separate, is called Gull Island, although I've never seen any gulls there. And you can then come back along the inside. And it's hard to see on this map. I should have picked a different route, but like these little cuts are all paddleable. So a lot of times when I get to like the middle of the slough, I'll cut in and just kind of explore all these weird little channels that cut into the island. And it's a great way to sneak up on wildlife because you kind of turn a corner and there's a family of otters or a heron hunting or something. And it's just, if you're quiet and you're kind of low and the grass is tall. This end point is another spot that's like filled with streaked horned larks. It's not very common to find streaked horned larks anywhere anymore. Along the river, sometimes people see 2, 4, 6. This end of the island that's dredge spoil, I often seen 60 to 80 horned larks. There's a huge flock there, which is really cool. Lots of otters in the back river in that slough. Bald eagles nest on Crimm's Island. And then that horned lark flock often has really rare birds mixed in with it. So I've gone out to Crimm's a lot because for whatever reason, this big group of horned larks, other kind of wayward, unusual visitors to the area, like join up with them. So on the left, you can see some horned larks flying, and then this white bird is a snow bunting, which can be tough to find on the Oregon coast and really tough to find inland, but they're often on Crimm's Island. Here's that horned lark again. And then sometimes mixed in with the horned larks are Lapland longspurs, which are another bird that can be pretty tough to find on the coast, really tough to find inland. And for some reason, these horned lark flocks attract these other birds. And then the last set of islands are Wallace and Cooper and Eureka. And so this is right off of Klatskanai. A lot of you probably know Jones Beach. The big one's Walker, which is really cool because it's split in half. So you can kayak right through the middle. It's really beautiful in the middle section there. And then this area between the islands is really beautiful too. Cooper Island is this kind of smaller one. And then this one kind of way out towards the Washington side is sometimes called Eureka Bar and sometimes called Quill Island. But it's another kind of island that's a good mix of habitat. There's forest, there's dredge spoil, there's beach, lots of cool birds to see from the island and on it. Some of the paddles I've done have been from Jones Beach, like the one on the left. So kind of going in along the slough here off of Marshland, which is like this community's name, cutting through Wallace Island, going out and around Eureka Bar and back. And then this weird route that I've done a bunch of times that looks like a whale. This is starting in downtown Klatskanai at the Beaver boat ramp, and you paddle out the Klatskanai River, which is really great. And then when you hit the slough, either going left or right and kind of exploring around, coming back in. Part of the reason I like going from the Beaver boat ramp is you get to go past this really cool Klatskanai River bridge, an old truss swing bridge, a railroad bridge that's almost always turned open. It's fun to paddle real close to. And along the Klatskanai River, I see tons of Hutton's vireos, which isn't a super rare bird, but not a bird you usually see in big numbers. And for some reason, they like that little area. I think there's like a poplar farm on the east side, and there's something about that wooded area that there's lots of Hutton vireos, which are really cool little songbirds with a really angry, scolding call. So when you get close to them, you know that they're around because they don't want you near them. And then some seals from out on the river. And there's camping on all those islands too, which is really cool. Like I said, I've done all day trips, but these places seem like they'd be phenomenal camp spots. Eureka Bar, the really small one that's sometimes called Quill Island, does have some people kind of living at the south end. So it was kind of interesting to find this map online that said, please don't camp here, with it had a little subnote saying this area has already been disturbed too much by people, basically. But every time I've gone by, there are people for sure living there. But this side of the beach looks really cool. And on the other island, the larger one, Wallace, there's this big kind of sand duney area that's raised up. And then I guess there's a smaller area here that has camping as well. This side of Wallace is really protected. There's almost always like thousands of scaup in this little almost bay area tucked on the channel side of Wallace. It's a big hunting spot, but as long as it's not really, really early in the day or really foggy and I'm in a bright orange kayak with a bright orange life vest and hat, I feel pretty safe out there and can get really close to these just huge rafts of ducks, which can be really fun. Wallace is cool too, because when you cut through the middle, there's lots of animals I don't think of as being on the Columbia, but I think of as being on like backwaters. Like I've seen lots of, I think these are painted. And I think I've seen like sliders in there. So just some cool turtles in that inner part of Wallace. And then the part out by Eureka Bar, I don't know what it is about the channel there, but there's always dozens, if not hundreds of harbor seals. Like they kind of just pop up all around my boat and are always really curious and fun to see close up. That's all I got. I feel like that was kind of rapid fire on the islands, but I know most of you have paddled in some of these places and are expert paddlers. And so I feel like the paddling and visiting the island part was kind of a fun project of mine when I was getting to know Columbia County when I first moved out here. But the river birds are definitely tough to learn at first, especially from a boat when you're bobbing on the water. But I think the Merlin app, I cannot recommend it highly enough. And of course, a good field guide like a Sibley's can really help you get started learning what things are out there and what they look like and what to look for. So I love taking pictures out there. So if any of you are on Instagram, my tag is Teacher Tom Birds, and it's just birds. It's just pictures of birds. So a lot of them are from my kayaking on the river, but just a lot of them are other pictures I take while I'm just out bird watching. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them.
Thanks, Tom. This was great.
Awesome.
Cool.
Really, it was wonderful. Thank you.
There is a question in the chat asking how many miles the whale route is.
Oh, good question. I don't know if I had it on there, but I can look that up and let you know. It's long. I think it's maybe like 14 or 15 miles total. That's
Yeah.
kind of the longest paddle I usually do in a day. And I feel like coming back down the Klatskanai River at the end of the day to Beaver Boat Ramp, like I'm pretty ready to sit down somewhere and have a beer. But you know, on a nice day, especially in the winter, I feel like I kayak a lot in the summer too, but there's nothing like kayaking, especially on the river in the winter on a sunny day. It's like, it feels like a really special kind of thing to get to do.
Yeah, for sure. Are there other questions? Feel free just to ask.
Not really a question, but you mentioned you don't normally see a lot of beaver on the main channel of the Columbia. There are a ton out there, and it's kind of shocking. I live in a floating home, and they're all over.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I live pretty close to Dalton Lake, which, if you don't know it, it's just north of St. Helens, just before Columbia City, and there's a pretty active beaver group there. So I see them swimming off that part of the river, and then, like I mentioned earlier, around Gull. But that's cool that you see a lot of beavers. I think that's really awesome.
So Tom, in the chat, there's are you considering writing a book on this topic?
Funny, I am working on a book, but it's a field guide to the birds of the Northwest for kids. I'm a fourth grade teacher, so I talk a lot about birds at school just because I go birding a lot and I'm really into birds. And so, yeah, I'm working on a field guide for kids, but I think it'd be cool to write a book about this part of the river. I'm shocked how many of these islands they're really interesting to visit. They have really interesting histories. They have tons of wildlife. They're rarely visited by people. And yet, like, going online, I can't find a ton of information on them outside of the river trail map. So I feel like it would be a really cool, a few people would be really into the book, and most people would have no idea what it's about. But
well, add it to your list of summer projects when you're teaching.
Yeah.
There's a question.
I have a question. Oops often, sets up trips and stuff for people to participate in. Would you ever be willing to set up an island trip for a group of Oops people?
Definitely.
Yay.
Yeah, I do all this stuff on my own, which is not like because I love to or want to. It's just kind of how I fell into this hobby, because I've been kayaking a long time, and I kayaked on the East Coast where I grew up. But I started birding just 6 years ago, and I just kind of learned to do it on my own and did it alone. And then now when I go birding with groups, I'm like, oh, this is a really fun group activity. So I'm sure kayaking is the same. I always do it alone, but I'm sure it would be really fun to go out with a bunch of you and explore an area and see what we see.
Yeah, become an Oops member and come out with us. Sure.
Cool. Definitely.
There's some more questions. What do you know about Smith and Bybee and the slough between them? And then also a question about Fairview. Is it nice?
Fairview, I don't know about, but before I moved out to Columbia County, I lived in St. John's, and that's actually when I first bought a kayak out here. I went to Smith and Bybee a ton, and I would go early in the year when the water was high and when Smith and Bybee are connected. And I would put in at the canoe launch, which I never remember which one's Smith and which one's Bybee, but it's the further south one has the canoe launch. And yeah, I kind of had the same route I did all the time. That's actually how I got into birding. Is I bought a boat and started paddling at Smith and Bybee, and I just started seeing tons of birds that I felt like I never saw in my neighborhood. And so I downloaded the app I talked about earlier, Merlin, and now Merlin's even better because you can do audio, and if you record birds that are making noise near you, it identifies the birds, and it's very accurate. It also does photo ID too, if you can get a picture. But yeah, Smith and Bybee's awesome. It's a great place to paddle as long as there's enough water to get around, which, it's controlled. There's a section where it connects to the slough on the north side. So I know some years they let the water stay longer. Some years they kind of drain it early. I think it kind of depends on their management plans in terms of invasive species, because I know they're battling a lot of invasive species in that area. But if there's water, it's a great place to paddle.
Yeah, the slough actually runs between Smith and Bybee Lakes and Fairview. It's actually a very, very long, I don't know how many miles that is, 10, 15-mile slough. And it's really got a lot of wildlife. I just haven't been out there in quite a while. And I was wondering, is it overrun with homeless camps now, or have you been out there recently?
I used to explore Smith and Bybee a lot, but it's been a few years. I know a few folks who live kind of near the Whitaker Ponds Nature Park area, kind of near the airport, and they paddle on the slough there. And I think I know they have to do a couple wacky things like paddling through a culvert, which is not my idea of a good time, but
Right.
But there's so many. I mean, that whole area used to be wetland, and now it's all kind of been pushed into these sloughs and channels. So I think if there's water, it's probably a really cool place to explore.
Cool. Great presentation too. Thank you.
So was the question about Fairview Lake? Was that?
No, there's a slough. The Columbia Slough there below Government Island runs all the way from Smith and Bybee all the way down to Fairview Lake. It's connected, as Tom says. You do have to portage over a couple of areas, but you can make the entire trip. I've done it several times.
Wow.
Yeah, I know people who've paddled the slough kind of starting near Kelly Point Park, and you go down towards like the raceway towards like Force Lake, that area. And I think that's a pretty contiguous paddle. I think it's maybe 3 or 4 miles.
Yeah.
That's cool. And it's right in the city, which is kind of amazing.
Oh, yeah. Thanks a lot, Tom.
Hey, Tom, there's a question about if you can recommend some inexpensive binoculars to us.
Inexpensive binoculars. I'm not good about this, but the Portland Audubon shop up on Cornell Road, they let you borrow, try out, and the people who work there are super knowledgeable. So I feel like they're not going to try and sell you the fanciest, most expensive stuff. If you go into the nature store and you're like, I kind of want to start looking at birds, what's the thing that's cheap but isn't going to, break on me? They'll get you something really good. I don't feel like you need super fancy binoculars, and 8x42 is like the kind of standard. Anything higher optics, you're going to have a lot of like wiggle, and they're going to be heavier. But there's a lot of really cool. There's a company called Nox, Nocs, like because people call their binoculars Binox or Nox for short. And they're really cheap. They're like bright colors. They're kind of fashionable and cool. They're tiny and light, and I think they work great.
Cool. I know we're at 8 and I want to make sure we're respectful of your time. So I'm going to ask this one last question. What time of day and what time of year is best for birding?
Oh, it all depends on what you want to see. I mean, if you're going after saw-whet owls, you want to go out at 2 in the morning, and you want to go way out in the woods, and you want to get really good at doing owl impressions. If you want to hear songbirds during spring or fall migration, early in the morning is best when they're singing and are moving around more. The cool thing about the river birds is the time of day doesn't really matter, because like a loon or a grebe is going to be out floating around and hunting at 7 a.m. and at 4 p.m. because they just, that's all they do is they float around and dive and eat and hang out on the river. Also, time of year is huge too. So I swear I don't work for Merlin, but the Merlin app is such a great gateway into birding because, like I said, you can put in where you live and what time of year it is, and it's going to say right away, like, oh, you're likely to see a robin and a crow and a chickadee, and it's going to start with really basic birds that a lot of you probably know from your backyard, and then slowly go down the list. And I feel like that's a big thing early birders need to wrap their head around, is there's really common birds, and those are the ones you're going to see. You want to see rare and unusual things, but they are rare and unusual, and you're probably not going to see them. So starting to learn what's expected and what's common, especially for the time of year and the habitat, will really help you figure out what you're seeing or what you want to go see. And then the eBird account, I mean, if there's a specific bird you want to see, once you have an eBird account, you can look up the map of that bird, and you can see that Tom Meyer saw the bird at this park on this day, and Jennifer saw that bird at this other park on this day, and you can really see what's being seen in which places.
So I'm looking on my app store for Merlin, and there's different options. Merlin Bird ID,
Merlin bird.
Merlin Bird ID by Cornell Lab. Are those all the same?
Yeah, Merlin Bird ID is run by Cornell's Lab of Ornithology, and
Okay.
yeah, it's a really great app. The sound feature is really fun to play with. So if you just have some birds in your backyard and you can't see them but you can hear them, it's really great at identifying them. It can be fun to play with.
Cool. Thank you, Tom. There's been a bunch of thank you and great presentation, and lots of learning happened tonight. So if you get a chance to scroll through the chat before you go or save the chat for yourself, might be fun to see those kudos. I'm going to stop recording in case there's anything that anybody wants to ask not on a recording.